All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to our booth chat. I'm Alyea Canada. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Melville House, and I'm here today with Yang Ge and Jeremy Tiang, the author and translator, respectively, of Strange Beasts of China, and also with Alyea Canada, the book's editor and moderator of today's conversation. So I'm really excited for you guys to get your hands on this book. It's one of my favorites of the year, set in a fictional village in China, where beasts are living almost indistinguishably alongside humans. So this novel follows an amateur cryptozoologist as she's documenting the city's beasts. It's part detective story, part metaphysical inquiry. It's one of the most interesting books you'll read this year. I think fans of science fiction, fantasy, magical realism will just devour this. So we're going to take some questions at the end if we have time, so feel free to add them to the chat throughout. And be sure to head back to our booth after the event to find the first chapter of the book, as well as some links to Edelweiss and NetGalley, where you can download the eGalley. And I'm going to hand it over to Alyea now.
Thanks, Amelia. I just want to quickly say a little bit about what drew me to this book before we get started. So I'm someone who has always read a lot in translation. I think there is incredible value in reading across cultures and stories that maybe don't immediately feel familiar to you. I also spent the better part of my time in grad school thinking about the relationships between humanity and robots and how we are defining this very sort of vague term. And so when I came across Strange Beasts in the UK publisher's rights catalog, I was like, oh, this is like a perfect marriage of two things I'm very interested in. And I think I reached out to them maybe the day after Jeremy had turned in his translation. And when I read it, I was sort of awestruck. You know, it was very unlike anything else I'd read. Jan was dealing with a lot of these same questions that I was really interested in a very deft and playful manner. And I was just like, more people need to read this book. Perhaps a little selfishly, I would just like more people to talk to about this book. And so here we are, and I'm really excited that Melville House is publishing this. I'm excited for you guys to get a chance to read it, and I'm very excited to talk to Jeremy and Jan today. So let's get started. So Jan, you wrote this book, I believe, when you were 21. What's it been like to sort of revisit it now and see in Jeremy's translation and see it get sort of a second life in the English language market?
Hello, yes. Thank you for this introduction, Alyea, and thank you for I feel so excited when I hear about how you acquire rights when you first read the book, and I felt equally excited, or definitely, sorry, more excited when Jeremy told me that he wanted to translate this book. I was like, oh, can I buy you something? Because Jeremy and I were friends. So then I was sending him something that I wrote, but I really never thought he would actually be interested in Strange Beasts of China, because that was something I wrote many, many years ago. And it was quite different from the things, like the mainstream things I wrote. But it was definitely a privilege. Like, you know, this book I wrote when I was at a very young place, like not just age, but I think I was thinking about it today. It's like that to me, 21 years old, when I wrote this book, I was more like a beast. Like I was in this very kind of both very vulnerable and very sensitive, very susceptible, and also quite like shockingly straightforward with this world. It's a little bit like the child in the emperor's clothes, I think. So then this child just like say things as she intended. And I think it's really such a shock, and it really struck me. And first, I think to read Jeremy's translation and to revisit this novel, I just really enjoyed Jeremy's prose. Like, he himself is a terrific writer, and so that was like purely immersive, just to get to read his writing. And then to see the story again really reminded me of that inner beast of mine. I think that was something really important that I learned from reading this, because I think now I'm, 36. And so I think I've become, like more proper, more like a human, more like sophisticated. And then I won't say things the way I said it back, like not I as a writer, but I as a narrator. I think that spirit has more or less been rounded up or you can say lost. So I think it definitely kind of revived me, like reminded me of that inner beast of mine. And I felt that was something really important to my writer's spirit. So I am really, really grateful that this book is now revived.
Great. And so, Jeremy, can you tell us a little bit about how you came to translate this book, and if there were any sort of specific challenges, be it with style or form?
Yeah, so as Yen said, we became friends, and we were exchanging writing and getting to know each other's work. And there was something about this book that I found electrifying from the start as soon as I encountered it. It really is unlike anything else I've read. Yen is a tremendously versatile and creative writer, and kind of reinvents herself and reinvents storytelling with each book. There's something about this that was very raw and direct that later, when I found out it was written when Yen was 21, made perfect sense to me. And I think there was this challenge of translating it and accessing that same rawness and directness in myself, being not 21, and also channeling as I know her now, of the writer who both is and isn't Yen, and bringing all those into a single narrative and finding a voice that worked for all of that in such an unstable narrative where it feels like the rules of the world are constantly being undercut and reinvented, which is, I think, a sign of a sensation of what it's like to be very young and to feel like you're still getting to know the world and you're always discovering new things about it. And just to keep that sense of momentum and wonder and discovery.
Yeah. So, yeah, your narrator, who is both you and not you, is also a novelist. Was that like an intentional choice to have her sort of share a profession? And do you sort of do you see yourself there in her at all?
Yes, I think this incidentally, I think I was looking back at all the things I've written. I think there has always been a writer or a writery figure in all of my stories. I suppose I really enjoy the idea of an observer in the story, and quite often this observer is also the narrator. But in this book's case, it's really kind of, I didn't plan any of that. So this book initially was commissioned by an editor of this literary journal, and he just wanted me to write some. So this initially was commissioned as a serialized novel. So it's like each chapter will be published on one issue of this magazine, like every month. And so then that's why, and he asked me to do that. And then I began to write the first story, The Sorrowful Beasts. But then when I was doing that, I had no idea what's gonna be for the even chapter 2. So I think very interestingly, it seems very meta now you look back at the creating process of this novel, is that me as a writer was commissioned by an editor writing the stories of strange beasts, and I quite often couldn't quite meet the deadlines, and he was furiated, and then we were having this kind of like, I was like genuinely struggling with like meeting my deadlines of submitting all the stories of the beasts. And then in the story you have exactly the same writer who were chased by her editor to submit the stories about beasts. And then I think funnily, it's also kind of like a synchronized process to both me and the writer in the story, is that at the beginning, I think I was quite attached to the story, detached to the story. I think I was like wanting to take a break from my writing career. So I was like, I wanted to write something fun. And so I was quite like detached. I was like doing it quite playfully. But I think as the story goes on, both me and the narrator and the writer in the story got more and more involved, and it became more and more personal, and it became this thing that is quite heavy and sort of plunges quite deeply into our hearts. So yeah, I think this is, so in a way, I think it's a very, like, I didn't plan any of this, but then this really magical kind of like a meta process. I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Yeah, it's funny because, you know, the book, I feel like, does sort of have a tonal shift towards the end. You know, as the mystery sort of gets deeper, it does sort of take a turn where, yeah, it feels even more slippery, I guess, in terms of, as Jeremy was saying, like the world that's being built and the rules that they're all following sort of keep changing and sliding out from under you. I think along those lines, there's a lot of your book that has become quite relevant in different ways. You know, there's a mysterious disease, sort of this, you know, bringing closer science and the government, and has that changed sort of how you think about the book in any way, either of you, and how you interact with it?
Would Jeremy say something about this first?
Yeah, I think the great thing about this book is that it functions as a kind of allegory. So there's always going, because there's always going to be strife in the world, there's always going to be a point that feels relatable at a particular moment. And these characters are going through essentially outside forces, be it a mysterious illness or government oppression or just interpersonal conflict, just coming at them and having to navigate each crisis as it arises. So while it is true that I think the world has recently felt like we've been through a prolonged period of crisis, and that resonates really well with what we see in the book, where everyone is in a perpetual state of crisis. But at the same time, I read this book in the before times, and it resonated then too. And obviously it resonated differently. It was more about being in a world that I didn't quite know how to navigate, where crisis seemed about to erupt at any moment. So I think there are all kinds of ways you can read the book, and it's always going to be in some way a lens for our lives.
Yeah, I feel it's quite uncanny actually, because I got Jeremy's translation. I had, at that point, I had obviously forgotten what this book was about, like completely. Like I remember certain, like, because I haven't read it for like 10 years, more than 10 years. Then I was reading it, and then I think I was really struck by this little chapter, might have been chapter 7, where like the spoiler, when the writers, her cousin and the cousin's family went to travel in this like south to China, like the Southeast Asian country, and then was contaminated with this disease. And then when they came back, they were all put into quarantine at the airport. And then the city had voted to execute all of those people, so to like to prevent them from spreading this disease. And I thought, wow, when I read that. But then Jeremy had reminded me the reason for that being there was probably because this book was written very close to SARS. So that was 2003 SARS in Asia. And then this book was written, like published in 2005. So yeah, that was, so this was the only thing, but that really got me. Like when I read that, I was like, oh no, what happened? But then he reminded me, so there was a rational explanation for that.
I mean, it's funny because I'm from Singapore and lived through SARS in Singapore, so that was my immediate reference point. Although subsequent events have shown that perhaps because history is cyclical, we keep coming back to what may or may not be a reference point.
Interesting. Yeah, okay, I'm gonna pivot, but only because I am genuinely like want to know your answer to this question. So in the book, the narrator gets a lot of grief from people about always writing love stories and sort of, I guess, I don't want to say shoehorning them in, but like her stories, sometimes I think she gets criticized that the love story feels a little bit more natural in some places than others. But her argument is like everyone loves a love story, you know? So would you consider this novel a love story? either of you.
I think I'll say I wasn't really considering this whether being a love story or not, but I think it is very noticeable that the writer who wrote like that me engaging with this book was more like, would you say, daring and accept those quite straightforward human emotions? Because I think now it will be, I don't know, like it will be very difficult for me to write about love in a very straightforward way, as in two human beings or two beings fell in love with each other, like love as it's sort of would you say like its superficial or its original meanings. And now you have to kind of twist it, or you have to write it sarcastically. Like you just couldn't like address those themes as innocent, as passionate as you were like say 15, 16 years ago. So I think I was definitely addressing all those things very kind of, naively, genuinely, and also lovingly. So that was something I thought it was very precious, like that state of mind. Yeah.
But I think there's also something quite radical in that, in just saying, you know what, we're all human beings, we have emotions, and let's just be straightforward about that. We don't need to be tricksy about it. We don't need to intellectualize everything. And the narrator of this book is just very straightforward. And she's like, yes, I'm sentimental. Yes, I believe in love. Yes, I'm going to write about it. And there was something really liberating about that. So maybe I think this is a meta love story.
Yeah, no, one thing I did really love reading this is how everyone is just so straightforward with their emotions and sort of like, you know, I am angry right now. Like I am happy, I'm running away. Like I think there is something very refreshingly human about that in this story that is also has non-human characters sort of feeling the same emotions, but yeah, not feeling like you have to be cagey or like intellectual about them. I love that. I wish we could all go back to communicating our feelings that way with each other. So yeah, I'm also curious, do you guys have a favorite beast or one that you feel most connected to in the story?
Yes, for me it's the definite answer. And the beast that I feel most connected with was Flourishing Beast. So it was like in the middle of this story. Because so I wrote this novel. I was saying that earlier. I just wanted to take sort of a time off, almost like. So by the time when I was writing this novel, my mom had just passed away. So then I was in this very sort of like bad mental state, and then I think that story of Flourishing Beasts really kind of in a way alleviated my pain so much, and the way like the beasts taught me how to see the relation between life and death, and then this like women's community and how women support each other, and I do see my mom in that, in Flourishing Beasts. So I think when I wrote it, I definitely believed, or not believed, but I felt that my mom had become one of the Flourishing Beasts. So that was very, very important. Like Flourishing Beasts was like quite significant to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree that in many ways the Flourishing Beasts are the emotional center of the book. The beast that I keep coming back to is the heartsick beast. The only artificial beast in the book, in that they're human created. And they're kind of grown by humans and shaped by being fed food in very specific measurements and made to look a certain way. And that feels to me like an allegory for how we are formed as individuals. The older I get, the more I'm able to identify certain behaviors that I have, certain ways of thinking that connect back to particular formative experiences. Oh yes, that happened, and so now I do this. and just seeing the way that we think we're individuals and unique, but actually we're just a collection of all our experiences and all the things that we've been through and been told to or taught to think and do. So just seeing that laid out so clearly is, it just chimed with me.
Yeah. I also found myself drawn to the flourishing beast. You know, I think, yeah, that chapter is, you know, the emotional center. It was just so like visceral and moving and sort of, yeah, I mean, I don't want to talk too much about them, but sort of their life cycle was just, I think, one of the more poignant ones of the beasts we've discussed. So I think, Amelia, do we have questions we can? Sorry.
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions, and I'm going to kind of piggyback off of that last bit. Can you give some additional details about the beasts? What exactly makes a flourishing beast-like? What is differentiating them from humans?
I mean, that is one of the big questions in the book. What makes us humans? What makes us different from the beasts? And as we go through the book, I don't think it's a spoiler to say the lines get blurred. And what Yen said earlier about the narrator initially being aloof and then getting more and more emotionally drawn into the story and more personally involved is partly because her sense of boundary, her sense of being human and therefore different from the beasts slowly blurs away. And by the end, I would say the humans and the beasts have realized that they actually have far more in common than you would have thought possible at the start of the book.
Thanks, Jeremy. Jan, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think pretty much Jeremy has said. I remember when I was writing, like at the beginning of each chapter, there will be like this short, like introduction bit is like encyclopedia. And there was this one line repeatedly being used as sort of the last line of that is, other than that, they're the same to humans. So it's kind of like that sense of, you don't really know what makes them beasts. Because they weren't that different from humans. And it is this sense of this group of people, this group of beings were put into a subcategory and hence being depraved of their humanity. And I think that is the main sort of a theme this novel has been trying to address, is like to question what is human, what is humanity, what is like naming, to categorize, to subcategorize. And I think it's all like a movement of power. Like I want to penalize myself for bringing up power structure again, because like every time I just talk about it, but it is like the idea of that, you know, you put, in a way it's quite realistic. I think it's quite relevant to the world we live in and how we see different groups, different race. And yeah, so sort of like that, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question about magical realism, and do you feel a connection or a continuity with the novelists of magical realism? It feels like there's a commonality there.
What do you think, Jeremy?
I think there are fantastical elements, but it feels different to me. I'm not sure I can articulate how. I think there's something much grittier and personal, maybe, than what I think of as magic realism. It feels much more rooted in the self, and much more kind of the things of this world just taken slightly out of truth, just slightly distorted.
I was thinking about like now, if you ask me about, like, if you ask the current me to take a look at this novel, to say I would probably agree, But I remember when I wrote this novel, I was massively offended when people call it fantasy or magical realism, because I keep emphasizing it. This is pure realism, because I thought this was so realistic. This is the reality that I see, that how I perceive the reality, and everything I was trying to say was 100% like the ultimate truth in my life. So there's nothing magical. And I remember I had this fierce argument with this random person who very kindly actually was meant to be a compliment, to say, you know, this magical elements of it. I was like, no, it's all real. It's just going a bit cuckoo. But I suppose the question is, what is realism? Because like, I think realism is the most ambiguous genre, because what is real? And it's something that bears a massive question mark, I think.
Yeah, I just, I always thought of it, I think of it as a book sort of taking place in like the uncanny valley, like in this world that both is very recognizable and also not. And I think that was one of the things that really drew me to it, is that it does sort of touch other genres, but is sort of in this other space. Just my 2 cents.
It makes a lot of sense. So one final question, are there any plans for a sequel?
This is a good question. I did write like a sort of a sequel to Strange Beasts, and like in a sense it takes place in the same city, the same setting, and then the story of the writer, the fictionist in this, like the unnamed I, carried on in the sequel. So yeah, and me and Jeremy were considering perhaps working on it.
That's exciting.
I'd be excited to read that.
I'd be excited to translate it. So fingers crossed that happens.
Yeah, that's great. Something to look forward to. All right. Well, we're coming up on the end of our 30 minutes now. So I just want to say thank you to everyone. Jan, Jeremy, Alyea, thank you so much for being here, and to all of our guests. This was a great conversation. So if you head back to our booth, once again, you can find a sample of the book. You can find links to Edelweiss and NetGalley to get your e-galley. And we really hope you enjoy Strange Beasts of China. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.